linguistic objects, elf machines.
Greetings from Cyberdelic Space. This is Lorenzo, and I'm your host here in the Psychedelic Salon. Well, it's good to be back here in the salon with all of you once again. I guess that most of the big holiday celebrations and parties are over for a while, but it was nice while it lasted. How about you? I hope all of you had a few perfect moments during the past few weeks. I had a relatively quiet couple of weeks myself, and to tell the truth, it's been hard getting back up to speed. My plan for this year is to publish a podcast by the end of each Wednesday and Friday. And as you can tell, I cut it a little close already this week. And by the way, that's Wednesday and Friday Pacific time. If all goes well, I may actually get them out a little earlier each week, but the Wednesday and Friday schedule I think I can stick to, at least until further notice. Now, before I do anything else, I want to thank the people at Gigavox.com for making their Levelator product available online and for free. As you regulars here in the salon know, I've been struggling with volume levels for quite a while, particularly with these trialogues. And the one we were about to hear was the worst one so far. The microphone on Terrence was okay, and Ralph's voice was in mono and not too clear, and it sounded like Rupert's voice was only being picked up by the other two mics. And, in short, this tape was a mess, and so I just kept putting off doing this show because the cleanup on the file was just going to take so long. And then yesterday I was listening to a podcast from podcasttools.com and learned about the Levelator from Gigavox. That's G-I-G-A-V, as in Victor, O-X. Gigavox.com/Levelator, Levelator. Now, I won't go into a major geek out on you here, but for you other podcasters out there, particularly if you're doing phone interviews, you might want to check this tool out. All I had to do was drag the audio file to the Levelator, and it automatically brought all of the voice levels up to a relatively equal point. And it's, it's not perfect, but it's, it's free, and it sure did a better job than I could do manually, so a big thank you to the good people at Gigavox.com. And today's program, as you already know if you've been listening to this entire series, comes from the 7th tape of the trialogues between Terence McKenna, Ralph Abraham, and Rupert Sheldrake that were held at Esalen Institute in 1989 and 1990. And this tape was simply titled The Unconscious. And sure enough, it begins with Ralph Abraham explaining his bifurcation theory of the unconscious. But by the time they were halfway into the discussion, their talk had it had turned to orgies and to the competing forms of consciousness brought about by alcohol versus psychedelics. And rather than tell you how it ends, why don't I just put it on right now and we can listen to it together.
I'd like to try today an experiment in rapid induction. And then that might fail, and then we could fall back on it. But I think that we haven't tried to push our format in any way. We're now feeling more confident in, like here at home base at the Esalen Institute. So this would be a quick 1, 2, 3, where I would try to suggest some actual questions that you could respond to as if somebody in the audience had asked questions. You see what I mean? Trying to a rocket boost rapidly into a designated point on a target, as it were. So, the unconscious. Here's the 1, 2, 3 in summary. One is a theory, the bifurcation theory, that the unconscious was created one afternoon in a certain place. A curtain which then divided the conscious and the unconscious forever. An iron curtain in the species mind. And 2 is a question about the relationship between this bifurcation and other bifurcations. And then 3 is a theory which wouldn't have to be taken too seriously as to a particular relationship between this bifurcation and some other one that I'll propose for the sake of discussion. Well, all of this is very hypothetical. So, one, the unconscious. Well, I gave a talk recently in the History of Consciousness program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. That's the most successful program at UCSC, internationally known graduate program. Thousands of applicants every year for few places. So to begin with, I challenged them to change the name from the History of Consciousness to the History of Unconsciousness. So, as long as we restrict attention to a historical period, then there's not much to say, but all the interesting events I want to point out are prehistoric, so therefore we have to speculate. Among the possibilities are that the conscious mind developed from the unconscious mind. Another one is that the unconscious mind developed from the conscious mind, and another one is that consciousness existed always and that there was never any division. All these possibilities. So for the sake of discussion, I'll choose one, my favorite one, but only for today. And that is the consciousness is always and the unconscious is recently created. So that we can view it like this, where we have consciousness going on and then the unconscious begins one day, created by an accident in a historical accident or a natural law of evolution. In this fantasy, however, because of peculiarities in the conscious, in the evolution of conscious mind and culture and civilization and so on, more and more things were regarded as illegal in the current world view, and by the paradigm rejected from above the curtain to below, so that as we go along, unconscious begins growing from modest origins, while the conscious mind correspondingly shrinks. So eventually, it looks more like this, where you have conscious, unconscious, but this is growing. And in its growing, evolution, further bifurcations, morphogenesis, and emergence of form in the unconscious. So all what we identify today as fundamental deck furniture of the unconscious, the dreams, the archetypal symbols, and so on. All of that is evolving, has evolved from simpler origins and so on. And this history of the unconscious we seek to discuss. So I'll call that the bifurcation theory of the unconscious. Now, one virtue of this theory before going on to number two is that allows us to see our conscious mind in evolution from a universal conscious mind. The Gaian mind is then regarded as conscious. The animal mind is conscious. The mind of plants, all of it, we can speak of the consciousness of animals, the consciousness of plants, the consciousness of Mother Earth, the consciousness of Father Sky, the consciousness of their partnership in the nuclear family of the all and everything. And this is valuable if we could promote this somehow in terms of our future and relating with respect to the mind of all the other entities. Now, number two, this question is about the relationship of this bifurcation in the history of consciousness and other bifurcations in history of ideas, such as the fall of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, the fall of Archangel, Lucifer, other angels, and so on, the creation of the devil, the growth, the emergence, and the importance of evil, the empowerment of the negative mammon, and so on. We have a lot of other dichotomies which might have emerged from a unity by a process of mitosis, as it were, in the world of ideas. Then we could try to relate these bifurcation events to each other in time, or in space, or as waves, or causal relationships, or whatever, your favorite ones. So third, just for example, I'm going to recommend an example which, for me, was the source of my thinking about the history of unconsciousness in this way. So this is a specific hypothesis on the creation of the unconscious by the rejection of something according to a dogmatic paradigm. And this has to do with Marduk and Tiamat, the first creation myth that I know about that has the subjugation of chaos by a law and order executive, a cosmic god, the war between chaos and cosmos, won by Cosmos, the king of law and order. The first one I know about is Marduk and Tiamat, and this is historical and is written on tablets. It was part of the Akitu festival that I always talk about. It was celebrated for 2,000 New Years in a row throughout Babylonia by the Akkadians, the Semitic successors to the Sumerian civilization. And in this horror story, repeated every year and actually acted out by the king playing the role of Marduk, Tiamat, a dragon, goddess of chaos, is actually divided in two, murdered with a sword and stretched. The two halves opened like an oyster shell, forming the sky and the earth as the beginning of the Babylonian creation myth. At this time, this ritual, in a time when rituals were performed well and successfully in stabilizing the evolution of culture, chaos, which is essential to life and happiness, was subjugated. But we experience it all the time, but that was not allowed by the paradigm. And in this myth was created, I claim, the unconscious, the negative charge on the serpent image, the snake in the Garden of Eden, the innocent, the essential symbol of Mother Earth itself, the consciousness of Gaia, that this symbol came to be associated with Hades, with evil, with terrorism, with Pluto, with the torture of Ereshkigal, and submitted the torture of Inanna by Ereshkigal, and so on in the underworld, somehow is associated. Chaos goes to the basement, and with this gesture created a bifurcation in consciousness, giving us the unconscious, which appears to be gaining ever since. And in this gain, also, our life, our history of the human species, going and more into the evil, the demonic, the evolutionarily unsuccessful forms of society. That's the 1, 2, 3 of it.
I see. So you're in favor of a kind of fall theory of the unconscious?
Yes. One from which, if we adopt it, we could seek also to escape. And we would have a mechanism to escape because we have a historical map, as it were, of the creation itself.
How would this escape happen?
We would bring unconsciousness back into consciousness. We would take the deck furniture from the lower floors of the boat back up to the deck where it belongs. We would take back what's happening this is just an example of the chaos theory of the bifurcation or creation of the unconscious. In this case, we see that science, which is the main temple of law and order, is now having to eat humble pie and to accept chaos again. That's a good thing, I think, for our future. And this good thing is apparently happening more or less accidentally. But suppose that we had this talk in 1960, and we decided that we would try to do something something intentional to restore Tiamat to her throne, to bring up chaos from the unconscious and make it okay. Then we'd hunt around, these computer people, we'd locate Ed Lorenz, we'd popularize his model, we'd revolutionize the sciences on purpose in 1963, instead of waiting for it to happen spontaneously in 1973. And if we'd done that, we'd never know but that it would never have happened without our intentional intervention. Now, I'm not recommending an intentional intervention. I'm just saying that if some of these things are brought into consciousness, that the little that we do in our lives for the future generations, it consists of this discussion alone, maybe all it takes, you see, to bring something back from the basement, to put it in consciousness, starting a new upward spiral somewhere in the evolution of the spirit. Well, could it be that the unconscious was created? Could it be that there was a time in history before which there was no unconscious, there was no split, there was only one, which you wouldn't know whether to call it conscious or unconscious? I mean, we don't know what consciousness means, except to say it's the other one from unconsciousness.
What do you imagine caused this bifurcation?
I don't know. I know that in historical time we have this horrific story, Babylonian myth, in the sense of myth as the lyric of the opera, which is a ritual. and that all the rest of this story had Sumerian precedents, and this part didn't. So I'm not able to say, to speculate, that this had a 2,000-year history before Marduk. Marduk was the city god of Babylon, and there was a time when Babylon didn't exist. Other towns existed. Eridu existed in 2000 BC. Existed in Sumerian time. And they had their city gods. Every city in that early urban revolution, every city coalesced around a god or goddess. And the form of the goddess was materialized in the form of the city. And this is the whole idea of the sacred city. The god concepts, or goddess concepts, which were successful, which were attractors, created cities, and the other ones didn't. And you had, therefore, a kind of a morphogenesis in the full complex of population movement, urban technology, city design, and religion, ritual, and so on. And the successful ones accreted with other ones. And syncretism was the way in which empires were created. So before 2000 BC, we didn't have Marduk. It just didn't exist. Bel Merodach, he was called, and this was a synchronism from previous elements. So there are books about the serpent, about dragon image in mythology, and many cultures have dragon images, and they're all associated with chaos, and basically they're okay. Suddenly, we have St. George killing the dragon. We have St. Michael with his foot on the dragon's throat. We have all this energy given to killing the dragons in Celtic mythology in England, coming over into Christianity and so on. Now, I think it's important that that be undone. I think we want St. George and the dragon getting it on together in a May Day celebration where Dionysian elements are accepted. I think that it's possible that this particular bifurcation has to do with the patrilineal necessity of knowing who is the father of the children, and therefore the rejection of the ritual in which sexual license was an important part of the play, and that this patrilinear structure involved with the creation of the nuclear family brought about the rejection of the dragon and the killing of the dragon and so on. But this is a speculation. I don't know. Lately I've come to think it'd be nice to have a competing theory. I'm not sure we can blame everything on the patriarchal structure.
But now you're suggesting that it was the concern for male paternity that drove the breakdown of this whole...
That killed the goddess, yes. We couldn't have this goddess around who liked to seduce young men and so on.
Well, the suppression of psychedelics, it comes at that same phase, because the orgies driven by the psychedelic religion completely frustrated that desire to identify male paternity.
The rejection of psychedelics and shamanism and so on could be likewise associated. So now we're getting a certain collage of bifurcation events. And only so-called primitive societies have shamans. They have psychedelic rituals on a weekly basis, and they believe that spirits are alive in rocks and plants, and they believe this because they've seen them, and they believe in the reincarnation of the spirit, and that a human soul could reincarnate in an animal, and so on. So it's possible that a whole complex of things all disappeared at the same time because of some evolutionary selection, some unnatural selection, as it were. And it might be important to try to figure out the mechanism of this fall, because this is a really big fall, and now since these thousands of years we're suffering from the loss of this whole complex of ideas together, and I don't know if there's any one of them which is the cause. I'm not sure they were simultaneous, or if there was one place in the world where they were simultaneous. I can't accept blindly the theory of the Kurgan waves, the three Kurgan waves, and so on.
I think that over time, these mushroom-using people in the Sahara were transformed unwittingly into mead cults by a scarcity of mushrooms and the recognition that honey was a potential preserving medium for the mushroom. So as the mushrooms became rarer and rarer, the effort to preserve them in honey and to concentrate the use of them into large festivals intensified, and finally what you had were mead festivals where mushrooms were no more than a flavoring and ultimately no more than a memory. And that the shift from the psychology of a psilocybin mushroom cult to the psychology of a beer mead intoxicating cult is precisely the difference in emphasis of inner dynamics that would shift you from a partnership arrangement sensitive to social cueing to a patriarchal relationship insensitive to social cueing, which is precisely the effect produced by
first the mead, then the patriarchy?
The patriarchy and the mead and evolved together along with the concern for male paternity. It had to do with the suppression of orgies. This was a critical decision that had to be faced. Basically, the choice was between fun and full knowledge of the flow of your genes. And once it was decided that male paternity was an important issue, then the concept mine comes into existence. My women, in this case. My women, and then my children, and then my food, my weapons, my land. And this was the whole thing which this orgiastic, psychedelic, boundary-dissolving mushroom religion was holding at bay. It was literally a pharmacological intervention to keep that kind of a psychology from getting
Well, maybe
going.
it was an accident. You see, an accident in the kitchen, that mead took over just because, well, the climate warmed up and there was no other way to preserve it or something. And after the mead entered the kitchen by accident, and then all these other shifts followed. So this would be an alternative to the Kurgan wave theory.
This is an alternative to the Kurgan wave
Well, I
theory.
like that. I like that, Terence. I think we need an alternative.
Well, you see, it would happen quite naturally. You have this flourishing mushroom cult on the plains of Africa, and then the drying which created that situation continues, and you get, first of all, seasonality to the mushrooms. So that's all right. You just have these wonderful, huge seasonal celebrations, and your psychology can be basically intact. But then as the drying continues and the water holes are further and further apart, the need to preserve the sacrament and to spread it ever more thinly. I mean, this is the only scenario I can imagine by which psychedelic mysteries are lost, is if they actually slowly fade from the zone of occupation of the culture using them, and a substitute slowly takes their place in a way that is at least satisfyingly booze. They went from an ecstatic goddess cult of orgy to a drunken revelry of warriors and whores.
A two-phase theory, the psychedelic partnership phase or the alcoholic dominator phase.
This is one
drug-driven phase transformation, repeating itself endlessly, flip-flop, seesaw in the history of consciousness. I like that. And there's historical evidence as well in Crete, where we see this phase reversal phenomenon went on into historical times, ending there because the Dionysian ceremonies were apparently debased into alcoholic revels. And Orpheus was a reformer, trying to get the Dionysian religion back on track, as it were, with psychedelics and away from the booze. And it happened again with Pythagoras and again with Buddha. And
it happened with Dionysius turning into Bacchus.
Into Bacchus. Then it was the vine. It was wine.
The early Bacchus is a frightening figure whose practitioners fell into such frenzies of ecstasy that it was charged against them that they devoured their own children. The late, hairy-footed, lascivious Bacchus is simply an image of the alcohol consciousness made concrete, you know.
So if we took this theory seriously for a moment, which we won't too seriously with this two-phase theory, then we favored one phase and were in the other phase, and then we would seek the mechanism of a phase transition as you turn on heat under water and it boils or something. Then we would try to get psychedelic drugs back into the agenda and somehow get rid of alcohol. And this would then explain why alcohol is legal and marijuana is not in these societies and so on. There is some self-preservation function. There's a phase-maintaining mechanism within this phase, which has made it dominant this past 6,000 years.
Well, it's because it reinforces male dominance. Because
Why?
Why? Because if you technically analyze what alcohol does pharmacologically, it actually does diminish sensitivity to social cueing. This is a technical way of saying you turn into a boor and an oaf.
Zombie.
No. A libidinally driven oaf is what you turn into. And because you now have a reduced sensitivity to social cueing, and your normal good sense is impaired, you're prepared to make a sexual conquest. And most of the sexual neurosis of the Western civilization can be traced to incidents of early sexual imprinting in the presence of alcohol. How many women lose their virginity in an ambiance of a drunken, groping encounter? I mean, this is how it is normally done in the West. So that alcohol is so spun into our simultaneous terror and attraction for the sexual experience that it's just become scripted in as part of our cultural neurosis. I'm willing to bet that for 1,000 years in the West, nobody got laid who wasn't smashed.
I did.
It ends. The period I'm talking about ends before you were born, Ralph. So it's just a matter of, there's a good, a point for the discussion. The way in which our relationships to the material world, specifically drugs, promote or retard the expression of what we're calling the unconscious. Because one of the things that I think repels us all about drug abuse is that it is unexamined, unconscious behavior. And it's worth thinking then about how the unconscious is, in a way, an out-of-Tao relationship to the exterior world, because we can call it forth. We can addict to heroin or television and turn 90% of our lives into an indwelling in the unconscious.
Yes, well, I do this in my own life. I feel that I'm unable to become unaddicted, totally unaddicted. But I could be addicted to this or that.
Right.
So after I figured that out, I decided not to be addicted to chocolate, ice cream, alcohol, and a whole bunch of other things. And it seems very easy to make these choices. You can replace something with something else. You just touch it, and it's attractive. So then you get pulled away from this one to that one. Could this then be inserted in our educational system, rites of passage and so on, so that people know that they have a choice, and they don't have to be addicted only to alcohol and not to anything else, and so that they could actually choose, reclaiming free will without rejecting addiction.
This is what it has to be, because this is the kind of creature we are. And the addiction of addictions, which spawned this itch originally, is no addiction at all, but rather our natural connection into the hierarchy of Gaian information that was accessible to us when these nature religions were freely practiced. A sacrament is not a symbol. And the day they were able to sell people on the notion that a sacrament is a symbol, they severed the umbilical connection to the logos and then ran off the track and screwed everything up.
Well, to get back to the conscious and the unconscious here, I think it's not necessary to destroy the unconscious or to make everything unconscious become conscious, but I do think some growth of consciousness could be associated with some shrinkage of unconsciousness. And if we can't undo this bifurcation in which the curtain was developed, at least we could rearrange the furniture a little bit. So we see one way that might be relevant for doing this is giving people a wider choice of addictions. And in this sense, a restrictive society which narrows the choice of addictions is somehow anti-evolutionary, in that promotes the growth of unconsciousness, insensitivity, and danger to life and limb of the biosphere and so on. But what could be done besides, somehow diminishing alcoholism in society? What could be done for the advance of consciousness, to develop kind of telescopes, little stellarators, where we can look into the unconscious and regain? Dream analysis just doesn't really do it for people.
Well, your idea, Rupert, about the age-related reestablishment of shamanic sacraments might come in here.
I think so, yes. This is this idea that came up at Hollyhock recently, legalizing psychedelics in an age-related manner. Already we have age-related legislation. Before 18 in Britain it's illegal to buy and consume alcohol. After 18 it's okay. Before 16 it's illegal to buy and consume tobacco. After 16 it's okay. So now what about legislation? Before 30 it's illegal to buy and consume mushrooms. After 30 it's okay. Before 40 it's illegal to buy and consume, say, LSD. After 40 it's okay. 50 DMT, etc. There's a series of age-related, initiation-related legalizations, and your ability to purchase the substance legally after you've reached that age depends on being initiated into it. You have to go to be held at weekends, places like Ashland and Hollyhock, etc. Your friends for your 50th birthday know exactly what to do. They'd have a whip round to subscribe for the price of a free gift voucher for a DMT initiation, valid at either Omega, Ashland, Hollyhock, or the New York.
Yeah, this is a vision, you understand.
Anyway, there's an initiation. So there's a series of openings into other realms of perception. But you see, I don't think that the problem is so much that the unconscious is a kind of conspiracy or fraud. There's the fact that the whole way that nature works in all aspects is through the whole formation of habits. And as we know from our own experience, that habit formation involves going into unconsciousness, the principal model of which is habituation, found among animals right down to the level of stentor, unicellular ciliates. Habituation, where, like when we go into a room and there's a funny smell, you notice it, then after a while you stop noticing it, the background noises. Habituation is the way we actually personally experience and share with the entire animal kingdom, going into unconsciousness of a large part of the environmental stimuli and what's acting upon us. And it seems that the focus of attention is always quite narrow. What sensory systems and unicellular organisms do right through the animal kingdom is perceive differences. Differences in smell, differences in temperature, differences in pressure when you move your finger over something. All sensory systems, differences in movement. Sensory systems work on differences, and what become conscious of differences. And they're on the surface. It's as if it's on the entire surface of a largely unconscious system. The shimmering surface, where you notice differences, there's a kind of awareness or consciousness of differences, but the heart of the whole thing is unconscious habit. And the heart of all living systems is unconscious habit. However conscious we become, we don't become fully conscious of the unconscious embryonic habits that formed us, and the unfolding of human instinctive and cultural habits that have so conditioned our development and our culture. So there's these habits inbuilt in the whole of nature, and I don't think there's a kind of sinister conspiracy of unconsciousness. It may be that a sharper awareness of the interface developed at some time. I don't know. Maybe perhaps through psychedelic visions themselves, the sense that in certain moments you're conscious of things that in other moments you're not conscious of. You become aware of beings and entities and dimensions, etc., which you're not normally aware of. So it's not that you're conscious all the time, you're conscious sometimes. The fact that when you start from habit, that habit is a natural process that occurs in all nature, shimmering on the surface of the habits of atoms, of molecules, of crystals, disruptions and chaotic perturbations and so on, like crystal faults and fractures that make each crystal different and perfect form. There's a kind of consciousness associated with these discontinuities and differences. So everywhere there's this kind of awareness of difference, which is the kind of consciousness level, but below that is a large underground thing of habit or unconsciousness. And there's a sense in which shamanic journeyings, ritual practices like an annual liturgical year, where, like still today, September the 29th, the festival of St. Michael and all angels, liturgies and masses for the angels said all throughout the Christian world. A day of invocation and hymns to the angels. It's a day on which you become particularly aware and open to and invoke and talk to and communicate with the angelic orders. There's a day for it, and it's there today, it's practiced. Then there are other days like All Souls Day, when you communicate through requiem masses and relate to the souls of all the departed. Then there are the various saints' days that relate you to the lives, the lights, the kind of, as you were saying this morning, each saint representing a kind of Christianization of a sort of spirit principle, or in some cases even nature spirit principle.
The green men.
The green men and so on. So you have all this going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that somehow there's the sense in which through liturgies, through rituals, through psychedelic visioning, it's possible to come to bring to awareness, with a whole liturgical calendar, all these different qualities celebrated on different days throughout the year. This is found in Bali today, in the Catholic calendar, saints' days and observances throughout the liturgical calendar, and in the major festivals, the solar and lunar festivals like Christmas and Easter. So there is this awareness through ritual of all these different dimensions. They're brought into awareness. They're normally unconscious, but there are particular days in the year when they're brought into consciousness. You can't be conscious of everything all the time. We have a limited focus and awareness or attention.
So you're saying the calendar can be an engine for illuminating the
calendar of rituals that actually achieve opening. Yeah, I think that the theory of habituation, like sensory inhibition, is it's a good model for the mind, in which the whole thing is viewed as essentially unconscious, and that consciousness is a little window which roves over and could be redirected at will by a ritual or something at a certain part of the unconscious, which would then become, by a voluntary choice, conscious for a day. It would have its day of days.
Yes.
The unconscious that I was speaking about before is a region of this whole thing in which the contents have somehow become unavailable. And it's the unavailability that I would identify that as the ultimate unconscious. Let's call that then the unavailable unconscious. The unavailable unconscious has been growing since a certain time in history, where it's not possible to rove the window over it anymore because it's been declared illegal.
Terra incognita.
I think perhaps because it doesn't have its day.
Yes.
The orgy principle had its day, and still does in Indian holy festivals, sung and throw those around, and have phallic processions and so on. So, and reversals of the social order, those kinds of things are very alive in India. There's all these different principles throughout the year, which we find mirrored in Carnival and Mardi Gras and so on, the same kinds of festivals, you see, suppressed in the Protestant countries through the Reformation. So no longer did the goddess have her day in the various Marian festivals. All these female saints and St. Francis and all the rest no longer had their days. The 8 days of the angels were not observed. Only the most important biblical festivals like Easter and, of course, Christmas. So there was a great shrinking of the number of observed days. And Mammon doesn't have an observed day, and the goddess doesn't have an observed day. And all these principles are entirely unconscious in our culture because they're not collectively and publicly observed. So I think that probably the traditional model for bringing to consciousness what is so largely unconscious, not necessarily through an evil conspiracy or names of ignorance or anything like that, but simply through the natural tendency to habituation observed in the operation of all sensory systems everywhere, but things that remain the same. are not perceived, whereas differences are.
So unconsciousness proceeds by a lack of attention, as it were, only by focusing attention and having days and special rituals and so on, we could maintain consciousness. We would have to work at the maintenance of consciousness as we work at the maintenance of the garden and keep weeding and watering and so on.
And these mythic festivals you talked about were obviously a way of doing that. You reenact every year the drama of the myths. So that you bring the myths to consciousness and make them seen by the senses, heard, enacted and real in the sense that the king is consecrated as Marduk or whatever.
Yes, well.
So that and it happens on particular days in the year. That's how it works. That our attention is selective, and this has always been based on seasonal and festivals, liturgical calendars and so forth.
So you're saying everything tends toward unconsciousness, and it's only by this act of awareness pushing against this universal principle that we illuminate phenomena in consciousness.
Yes, and I think this relates to Ralph's model of the spirit, where he told us that on the one hand you have the soul, and on the other hand what you have, the body, and the spirit's what mediates between them. Well, it's interesting in the late medieval or Renaissance theory, or certainly the 17th century theory, the animal spirits were what mediated between the psyche, the soul, or the of the person, and the body. They were in an intermediate position, the animal spirits. Nerve impulses were thought to be due to animal spirits by Descartes. So the spirit is, if it's the surface or the interface between them, then it's that part which picks up differences, and in which differences can only be named through an awareness of differences. The only way a difference can be perceived, or you have to have a larger space within which it's seen as a difference, and that means difference is defined relative to non-difference or sameness or steady habit or whatever. It's measured against a background of unconscious habit which isn't changing. Or by clock time as a model for that. So that it's differences, and it's therefore differences that would be observed throughout. Gaia would be very conscious during ice ages because things would be changing at the beginnings and the ends of ice ages. There'd be a tremendous difference going on, and Gaia would come to a higher consciousness, as Gaia must be coming to a higher consciousness now through these large ecological changes.
So that's history is triggering this awareness.
Something like that. That it's to do with differences, and it's to do with rates of change, that consciousness or awareness are concerned. You know, in sensory physiology, the whole thing is to do with all these laws, logarithmic laws, about sensory perception of rates of change. 10 times increase in stimulus strength usually represents in a twofold increase in subjective stimulus, 100-fold, 3-fold. It's a logarithmic scale that the senses work on pretty universally.
Well, I think this is right. This is good. This is a theory of the importance of holidays. But there's still something wrong, because through the annual repetition of Christmas, which persists to this day, the consciousness is still gone because there's not enough difference, I guess. Every year Christmas is the same. I mean, people have they not completely forgotten the significance of Christmas? It's possible to experience Christmas with full regalia of angels on the trees and so on, and still to not have any awakening into consciousness of lost archetypes.
Well, that's precisely why Christmas is a child's festival, and why the delight of Christmas experienced by everyone, the ideal archetypal delight of it, is young children waking up on Christmas Day and seeing the stars and the angels, and the sounds and the bells and the presents. And the magic of Christmas is considered to work for young children. Adults feel somewhat guilty about being jaded about it, and there's a great impulse to recapture it through the delight of young children. And since it's a young children festival, it's a nativity festival, it's a child festival, it's a sacred child festival. That's the pole it touches in us, the sacred child. So I think that's what that particular festival is about, and I think that it operates quite well in its way as a reminding and reactivating.
So it works a few times.
I think it has a particular, because of its ritual power, there are a lot of people who only go to church at Christmas, for example. It's very common in England. In the Church of England, you have lots of people go at Christmas and Easter who never normally go at all. And so there are some people whose connection with the Christian faith is confined to these major seasonal festivals. And it therefore sort of still has a kind of the pulse, the basic ritual pulse of the seasonal festival year, of the liturgical year, is still alive, however sluggishly, in a lot of people. So it's not that most people have forgotten it. But one thing, I think, that one of the troubles with Terence and his suggestions is that they're usually the ideal state that he usually portrays, like his idea of moving over to an entirely lunar calendar to bring about feminine virtues and partnership values. His ideal predictions usually turn out to have been realized and often refuted by the world of Islam. Like the lunar calendar.
That's true. They were big on that.
And the other thing is that they were big on banning alcohol. One of the most important Quranic prohibitions is on intoxicating drink. And the result, therefore, is that many Muslims, mainstream Muslim culture, and certainly on the surface of righteous Muslim life, alcohol is not consumed. But in most Muslim societies, cannabis has been considered all right. It's still an intoxicant and still falls under a kind of Quranic prohibition, but not one that's taken as seriously as the prohibition of alcohol.
That's right. No, that's a good point. You're right.
So Islamic culture is a culture that the drug of which is cannabis, the largest part of the Islamic world, rather than alcohol.
Yes, although whether Islam has a drug at all could be argued. I mean, perhaps the drug of the Islamic world is coffee. Caffeine is more typical of the state of mind we associate with most of the denizens of that part of the world, rather than the affable states induced by cannabis. It's the shrill, argumentative, and mercenary arguments of the marketplace, and coffee managed to take that basic foothold and write itself into every labor contract on earth. It's the only drug sanctioned by industrial capitalism in the form of the coffee break.
They don't have smoking breaks, you mean, at factories?
No, they've never.
World.
That's right. They don't have cannabis breaks, but
do they have cannabis parties on the weekend?
I think cannabis is associated with a mystical strain in Islam that's definitely minority and doesn't really. When it has shaped Islamic culture, it's been episodic and far in the past.
Did you catch that part where Terence said that he thought that the only way the psychedelic mysteries could have been lost was through climate changes that caused the plants and mushrooms to become ever more scarce until they disappeared, along with the knowledge about how to use them? And it made me wonder a little bit about whether the Internet might play a role in preserving psychedelic knowledge this time around. Of course, what if the net goes down in some kind of a new dark age? I can't really foresee that right now, but hey, then again, I never thought my good old 8-track tapes would ever become obsolete either. So just to be sure that the core of this vitally important information isn't lost, everyone who can might want to think about buying a copy of Pikal and of Tikal, both by Anne and Sasha Shulgin. If you haven't already seen these valuable books, you might want to check them out, particularly if you're one of these chemists out there. Now, I think the Shulgins still have some copies left that you can order from their publishing company, Transform Press, which is at Box 13675, Berkeley, California, 94712. Or if you want to buy them through Amazon, I've put links to them at the top of our Amazon store page at matrixmasters.com. I've kind of let the email pile up these past few weeks, but there are a couple of things that came up that I'd like to mention. And the first one, I think, is one I've mentioned before, but maybe some of you missed that program, and so I need to bring it up again. And that is the fact that if you write to me and ask about where you can obtain any illegal substance, well, you're simply not going to hear back from me. At least for the time being, the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is still in place somewhat, and it allows us to discuss these sacred medicines in almost any kind of way we want to. The thing we can't do, however, is talk about how and where to get them. But please don't think that I don't understand how you feel when you're essentially out there on your own without any connections to the worldwide psychedelic community. I was in exactly the same place about 10 years ago. I'd moved to a new state, didn't know anybody there. I didn't feel like I could trust anybody at work to talk to about it. In short, I just thought I'd run out of options. So how did things change for me, you ask? Well, I went to hear Terence McKenna talk at Omega Institute in New York. And he told me about the Entheobotany Conference in Palenque, Mexico, and it was at that conference that the door kind of opened to this community for me. Unfortunately, that conference series no longer exists, so where does that leave us today? Well, here are 3 events that might hold some promise for you to meet like-minded people, and I'm sure that there are more of these going on as well. The first one is taking place on April 20th in Amsterdam, and you can learn more about this event at www.dopefiend.co.uk and listen to the Dopecast for more information. I'm not sure exactly what kind of event this is, but it sounds really similar to the Cannabis Cup parties that are held every November. And my guess is it won't be as big as the Cup, which had over 2,000 people there the year I attended. But with the crew from the Cannabis Podcast Network as a part of it, I'm sure that you'll have a great time there. Hard not to have a good time in Amsterdam, isn't it? And the next big event that I know about will be from June 13th through the 17th in Costa Rica. And this is John Hanna's 2007 Mind States Conference. While John does a large conference every other year in the States, I've been told by several people who attended the alternative ones out of the country that they are the closest conferences you're going to find to the original Entheobotany series in Palenque. And I'm not sure where the ticket sales on that conference stand right now, but I think John keeps attendance down at these out-of-country events down to around 100 people or so. So if you're thinking about going, you might want to get your reservation in early. And all the information about that conference is online at mindstates, mindstates.org. And, of course, the third event that I'd recommend is Burning Man. And now, the problem is that it's really expensive to go to any of these events, and there's no getting around that fact. When I was working in the corporate world, it didn't seem too bad. I just took several short vacations each year to attend a couple of conferences. But now that I'm essentially in the same boat that a lot of students are, I don't have much disposable income. And so in my case, rather than do something different each year, at least for the time being, I've decided to just go to Burning Man each year and pass on the others. And for those of you who can't make any events like these this year, well, that's one of the main reasons that I'm doing these podcasts. At least this way you can get some of the information that's available. It's not as good as being there, of course, mainly because the thing that sets these other events apart is that the people that you're going to meet there, they're really spectacular crowds usually. But let me circle back to where I started here and say that you shouldn't expect to find sources for any illegal substances simply by showing up at a conference or two. Thanks to the draconian laws that have made outlaws out of people who ingest certain plants and chemicals, our community has become wary of strangers. So my advice is not to be a stranger. Attend as many events like these as you can get to and get to know the people there, and more importantly, let them get to know you. Even the narcs do it this way, which of course makes it even more difficult for good guys like you and me, but that's the way the game is being played these days. So let's just hope that the rules become a little more sensible before much longer. I said that's the first thing I wanted to talk about, and there are a couple of other email topics that I'd like to get to today, but if I don't quit talking pretty soon, I'm not going to get this program posted, so I guess I better sign off. And before I go, I should mention that this and all of the podcasts from the Psychedelic Salon are protected under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 2.5 license. And if you have any questions about that, you can click on the link at the bottom of the Psychedelic Salon webpage, which you can find at matrixmasters.com/podcasts. And if you still have any questions, you can send them to me in email. Address is lorenzo@matrixmasters.com. And thanks again to Jacques Cordell and Wells, for the use of your music here in the Psychedelic Salon. I hope you guys are going to have a terrific year this year. And for now, this is Lorenzo, signing off from Cyberdelic Space. Be well, my friends.
Linguistic objects, help machines.
Greetings from Cyberdelic Space. This is Lorenzo, and I'm your host here in the Psychedelic Salon. So here we are, back for the conclusion of the trialogue between Terence McKenna, Ralph Abraham, and Rupert Sheldrake on the topic of the unconscious. And since I've got a few things I want to comment on at the end of this program, I'm going to keep this introduction mercifully short and get right into today's trialogue. What I'm going to do is to begin by playing the last few minutes of the previous side of this tape to give us a little continuity from the last program. And so we'll begin with Terence McKenna's thoughts about the drug of choice for Islam.
Yes, although whether Islam has a drug at all could be argued. I mean, perhaps the drug of the Islamic world is coffee. Caffeine is more typical of the state of mind we associate with most of the denizens of that part of the world, rather than the affable states induced by cannabis. It's the shrill, argumentative, and mercenary arguments of the marketplace, and coffee managed to take that basic foothold and write itself into every labor contract on earth. It's the only drug sanctioned by industrial capitalism in the form of the coffee break.
They don't have smoking breaks, you mean, at factories?
No, they've never.
World.
That's right. They don't have cannabis breaks, but
do they have cannabis parties on the weekend?
I think cannabis is associated with a mystical strain in Islam that's definitely minority and doesn't really. When it has shaped Islamic culture, it's been episodic and far in the past.
Oh, I think in India today, there's a very strong cannabis element to Islamic culture. It's the drug that most young Muslims will smoke or take rather than alcohol. Many of them will have tried it and certainly know its use. And there are certain Sufi dargahs near Hyderabad where they dance into frenzies and so on the annual festivals and so on, where in that kind of Sufi shrine, smoking cannabis is quite normal. It's, fakirs smoke it like Hindu holy men. Mm-hmm. And although it's not exactly all right from the point of view of Islam, it's the drug of choice. And also, I went to a dargah in Srinagar in Kashmir, where it was a Sufi shrine, and in it was the cannabis room where they had legally on sale hashish, and people sitting around smoking in the Sufi shrine. There's a special room, a smoking room attached to the shrine. So I went with my friend I was staying with, and we sat down and we had to smoke there. It was a fairly depressing place in the sense that most people there were the derelicts of society. Mm-hmm. And it was a little bit like a kind of wino atmosphere. And one could see why the prejudice against cannabis develops in Islamic countries as well. Mm-hmm. Because it's associated with the kind of wino, down-and-out derelict.
Sleeping in the street.
Yes.
So what's missing is the ritual, the calendric ritual, the ritual use, the guided trip that maintains a culture.
Well, Cannabis Day, there'd have to be, like the Indians have the holy plant Tulsi. I'm sure there's a Tulsi Day, mm-hmm. and they pay honor to the Tulsi plant every day by walking around it. Women do, the basil. They did at the house where I lived in Hyderabad. Every morning they'd touch the plant, do a little puja and walk around it, circumambulate and light an incense stick, just as part of their morning ritual. So here's a sacred plant associated with fertility and women's rights and powers. It's interesting, it means king, doesn't it, in English, basil. Mm-hmm. So if there were, for example, Cannabis Day, you'd have days in which these different principles were recognized, made clear.
There could be a booze day. That would be okay.
There could be a booze day. Yes, indeed. There'd be a booze festival, like the Scottish
Bacchanalian festival.
Hogmanay. I mean, that's the traditional booze festival. It's Hogmanay, New Year's Eve.
And addiction would be controlled by rotating it around the different crops, as we're told to avoid food allergies by changing our staple food every 5 days.
So you'd have a calendar round of intoxicants, each one associated with a particular asterism on the horizon or something like that.
Since the plants are already associated with celestial bodies in medieval herbals, there's already this association in herbalism. It's, in some cases, it would merely be a matter of looking it up. I mean, recovering the old perception, because they had perceptions of these relations.
Well, maybe we could have a practical step toward the resurrection of this cycle, just through the publication of a calendar in which the associations are mentioned and recommended.
Well, such things almost already exist, don't they? Sacred day calendars. I've seen several versions, none.
But with plants and addictions, is there a booze day and a cannabis
no, I don't
day?
think I don't think it's got to the stage of new dates being
we'd have to add that in.
The choice of dates and everything.
I think the Alexandrian Institute or the Deep Society or somebody could be induced to publish this project.
Well, I think as long as Cannabis Day occurs more frequently than once in the solar round,
we could associate it with something fast, like Mercury.
Once a month. One day in the lunar cycle. Each lunar cycle would be Cannabis Day, I would think.
Yes, or possibly.
Well, there'll be lobbies, I suppose, for every plant.
I think weekly would probably be best, since it would become a foundational thing. You see, the Christian sacrament of Holy Communion, taken weekly by most people, involves the sacred sanctification of wine. The ritual element, the central sacrificial element, is wine, and there's no doubt that alcohol has this, and the fermentation and the corn and all those kinds of things are a central part of these mysteries, ancient mysteries, come in the Christian form.
Which is wine on Saturday, beginning maybe at Friday sundown.
Yes,
cannabis on Sunday.
I think cannabis on Friday, actually, because cannabis is the Islamic Sabbath. I mean, it's the Jewish Shekinah day. Friday is the day of prayers of Muslims and is their most sacred day, and cannabis is their, if anything's their sacred plant, this is it. Then Friday evening is also the invocation of the Shekinah in the Jewish custom, the invocation of the feminine presence of God, or the Sabbath bride, by the woman lighting the candles at sunset on Friday evening. Well, Robin Sylvan, you know, has readopted this invocation of the Sabbath bride, and like other Jews who've been to these sort of Jewish revival work weekends led by Lynn Gottlieb and people, it's all to do with reconnecting with the sacred festivals and observing the Sabbath as the first step, and actually sacralizing the flow of time. Well, he's done it by, they light the candles and then they smoke together and talk. Great. And that's Friday evening's their evening for meeting, and in a kind of sacramental spirit. And so Friday is the Cannabis Day, and I think that's probably a good day for it. It's also the Goddess Day, you see, Friday, Freya, Venus Day. So I'd advance Friday as my top choice for Cannabis Day.
Beginning Friday at sundown, you mean?
Yes.
And then Saturday at sundown, Alcohol Day.
Yes, Saturday at sundown, Alcohol Day.
Yeah. Monday morning, one takes coffee.
Tuesday tea.
Yes, Tuesday tea. And Wednesday, presumably, DMT.
Well, we need rituals so that when consciousness is restored by difference through the change of the medium, as it were, then this consciousness would be focused on some submerged furniture through an actual ritual associated, as this Friday night ritual is associated with the Shekinah. And, Sunday is the sun, so here we could have the salutation to the sun.
Yes, Surya Namaskar.
Surya Namaskar.
Monday we could have
Sunday sunrise. Monday.
Well, moon festivals. We could have a moon observance. I mean, actually, it'd be quite easy to reclaim the week because the names are all still there.
Yes, the week is a good way to go, I think. Annual is like too slow for modern society.
Oh, I think annual's a really good one as well.
Yeah.
Well, you have these many cycles running, and then...
Well, seasons. For people to be unconscious of the seasons in modern cities, this is really...
Well, notice that what you end up suggesting is that the reclamation of the unconscious has to do with directing attention into time.
Using these mechanisms.
The time is the body of the unconscious, apparently.
Well, time is the mediator of the differences. Time is the enemy of habituation. Time is the strategy subverting sensory inhibition.
Time is the theater of habituation as well. So time and attention used creatively banish the unconscious.
Well, I don't know how they banish it on an annual basis. I mean, they still mean that a lot of these things go unconscious again for much of the year, but they keep each aspect of the collective consciousness, which is far larger than the everyday consciousness, because it includes all the mythic and ceremonial realms. By this annual connection, they keep the whole collective consciousness aware and in acknowledging on a systematic basis these different dimensions of...
So symbolically, the unconscious is death.
Symbolically, the unconscious is death.
Yes, because it's the absence of awareness.
Or is it sleep?
It's sleep and death, which are often equated.
Yes.
And so then if sleep and death are the principal images of the unconscious, we then have the curious intermediate form of dreams, which are intermediate between unconscious and conscious life in some sense. They're conscious after a form, but not fully conscious, and they occur when we're unconscious and we rapidly forget them.
And a role for meditation in maintaining consciousness through a voluntary fluctuation, difference in awareness. Well, in the annual cycle, people should become, and we should become more aware of the zodiacal sign, not the fictitious zodiacal sign of Western modern astrology, but the actual asterism in the sky through which the sun is now passing. And
we'd become much more aware of the movements of the heavens. If for example, Thursday, Thor's Day, or Jupiter's Day, Jovidi, is associated with Jupiter, as it is, or Saturday with Saturn, that on those days you actually see those planets in the sky, you learn where they are, and you know on those days where to look to them, because you have to direct your consciousness towards them to come under the beneficent influence of their principle.
And even if they're up in daytime, you can still be aware of what part of the sky they're in.
Exactly, and the rituals of these different days would involve actually connecting with the intelligences of the planets, which is what the names of the days are named after.
There could be sort of accelerators in public places, like a big tube which is aimed at the place in the sky where Jupiter is, a little clock adjusts it, and you just go up when you're passing by, and through looking through it, you're aware of the fact that even if you can't see it because it's daytime, that's where Jupiter is.
That's right.
Thursday.
And then these things are set either by a technician or by some remote control program more easily, so that the next day you'd have Venus, Friday. And then Saturday you'd have Saturn, and each day there'd be a renewed awareness of the planetary bodies, and you might also have to include something for the more recently discovered ones, Pluto and Uranus and so on.
Well, several days would have two readers.
But this then would be returning onto a modern version of those medieval cathedral clocks that show all the astronomical configurations.
And they should be in towers, but of course these towers will be associated with shopping malls instead of with cathedrals and abbeys and so on, because shopping malls are actually the modern equivalent of the medieval abbey.
I see. They've always seemed to me the most desolate and desanctified of places.
Well, I was at Glastonbury Abbey recently, and they have, in little museum, and then there are drawings and reconstructions of the place, and there's this huge, outside the wall, there's this huge market which goes on, which is exactly like a shopping mall. People have their stalls selling things, and shopping malls are really like bazaars, you see, because you have one big building, and then you have little shops with no walls around.
They're souks.
Yes. And the only thing missing, of course, is the actual abbey.
Mere detail, because a bank sits
but
in
we'll
its
put
place.
that back. We'll know where to put it, you see, because we have to put it back in the middle of commerce where people like to go for shopping. And then between the jewelry store and the grocery store, one would pass by this tower, which if you felt like it, you could ascend, and then take the darshan of Jupiter and Pluto.
Yes, somehow I so hate shopping malls that I'd rather be able to go to it without having to go past all these shops.
Yes, I would too, but...
So we have to have the freestanding version, or the ancient sacred site version as well.
Yeah.
Because if these things are placed on sacred sites within each, like each town had its temple or sacred site, you could have a sacred center of each place where this is.
Well, in North America we don't have sacred sites. Only in Europe you have them. Here we have...
Well, these would be on Native American sacred
Disneyland
sites.
and, well, there's Yellowstone, there's big mountains, geysers, and some natural features where people go, but we don't have this thousands of historical sites that people like to visit on the weekend.
All right, well then we just have a few of these. They'd be made for a limited edition to start with, and they'd be installed at Esalen, Hollyhock, Omega, etc.
Yeah.
Places where a daily ability to be related to the reigning planet would actually intrigue a lot of people who came here to look through. And it would be a novel feature. Everyone would talk about it. It would be fairly easy to make, especially if it were manually operated.
It'd have to be a staff position, you see, where these work-study scholars, they call them here, rotate. They're quite happy at their work because they rotate the job, so they have this novelty factor. 5 days of dishes, and then suddenly you're doing the sheets. Then you're out cutting the lawn. Well, one of the jobs would have to be the maintenance of the tubes pointing at the heavens. And the person who did this would have a dunce cap and a long robe of linen, and go about setting. Maybe there'd be a little truncated pyramid with a top, and you climb up the stairs like in the Yucatan, and then you have these tubes pointing and a little plaque that explains. So one person would come properly dressed every morning and adjust them for the day's planet.
Like those Arabic or Mogul observatories, like you see there. They're like parks, where there's one where you go up a long ramp, and that gives you a view on something.
Right.
And then there are all these different ramps and tubes and sort of semicircular, so you can get all different viewing angles. That's exactly it. It's a kind of astronomical theme park, in a way, where you've got all these apparatuses which actually enable it to become a reality for you, in relation, by walking into it and climbing upstairs and moving around in it.
Parks.
So I think Stonehenge and those places must have had something of this quality.
They still function in this way for a lot of people.
So the thing is, it's not difficult to construct henge-like structures or these astronomical tube setups. So we'd start with a few selected places, a kit that could probably be mounted on a sort of couple of yards square
The henge
area.
kit. We'll sell henge kits.
Well, this would first be the tube kit, the celestial observation kit with
mini henge. Would be the first product.
Yes, and then we'd have the complete henge kit, which for use at schools, institutions, etc., where people have got commanding views and or farmers or open-air entrepreneurs in the countryside. You would have these henge kits established, where you've got the entire line of view of, if you sit in the center of the exact horizon position of midsummer sunrise, equinoxes, the rising points of the moon through its 18-year cycle of moving along the different points. All these marked out by the coordinates of henge with a booklet, maybe a computer program explaining exactly which ones to look for when. And then relation to the heavenly bodies through sitting in the center of a henge could become, again, a living experience for millions of people.
Yeah.
Public parks could have them.
Yes, people would go for it too, because they would find out through experience that something actually does happen to you when you look at that part of the sky, that the direct sight, personal observation of the sky has this effect on consciousness. It's cheap, it's easy to obtain, and it's fun. It's as popular as Disneyland.
Exactly. So if this kit were designed, first the tube kit and then the henge kit, based on a reliable study of ancient henge monuments, including wood henge, the materials used. It could be wood, you see, because wood henge, or it could be stone, in which case one would have to send out it would simply be an instruction manual for the kind of local stone to use.
A computer program could aim the tubes.
Yes, and also help with the alignment of the stones, although the best way, in fact, to do it would be to do it in reality, to go to the central point and observe the sunrise on the summer solstice.
Yes.
And mark the point, and actually do it by observation.
Sunrise observation is the easiest one to understand.
So
the heliacal rising of Venus, that's harder.
Somewhat tricky.
Yeah. You have to recognize Venus.
And you have to watch for several days.
And then so much would be reclaimed, which the remnants are still there in the names of the days and the months and all these saints' days and so on. The remnants are everywhere. They're reclaimable. It's probably not too late.
That's
Place
right. And the other thing is that the idea of equality of time, which is what this is about, the idea that time has its qualities, is something that already has a popular following, and the millions who follow astrology in a vague or more professional way.
Well, the horoscopes in the newspapers.
Exactly. There's a vast... I mean, it's not as if this is a new or esoteric idea. It's, in fact, much more popular than among uneducated and among
magic or any other pagan element suppressed by modern science. This is the most popular one, is political astrology.
The popular faith that time does, in fact, have variable qualities.
Well, the
and
position
times
of the planet,
birth, etc., moments of important events, etc.
Well, judicial astrology. I mean, who is doing the horoscope of August 2nd and the invasion of Kuwait and so on?
Someone, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm sure they are.
But probably the United Nations is not consulting it.
Probably not, but maybe Saddam Hussein is.
Maybe he is.
But elective astrology, which is the kind most commonly used in India, like picking the right date for a wedding or for starting a new business or something, I suppose it may be. I don't know whether Saddam Hussein is using that kind of astrology. Maybe not.
Well, if henge kits were about, and people then recovered their consciousness of the sky, then they'd be more interested in elective astrology because it would mean something in terms of their experience of watching the sky.
And present-day astrologers got detached from observation.
It's totally detached from the sky.
My endless complaint to astrologers is that I've never found one who can actually point to me the positions of the planets. If I ask, where's Jupiter tonight? Because astrologers don't know any more than anyone else. Hardly anyone knows.
No, because the official zodiac has got separated from the real zodiac by the precession of the equinox.
So this thing with these henge monuments they'd connect us with the sky, and in that sense, through making us conscious of the quality of time and the relationship of the Earth to the larger celestial organism, would obviously create by direct experience some awareness of the heavens. I think people are probably even more they're more unconscious of the heavens than the Earth right now. I mean, most people are literally don't know what the different constellations are, what phase of the moon it is. Modern city life leads to an almost unconsciousness of the heavenly realm. Whereas we're very conscious of the Earth realm in terms of we know about the cores of the Earth, we know about, everyone knows geology and tectonic plates and stuff. Our attention is Earth-directed, very much so. And so this heavenly connection is obviously an important step.
Yeah.
And then there's the only other question I can think of is the realm of psychedelics and the rediscovery of the realms of the unconscious. Presumably different drugs, different psychedelics and different other drugs tune one into different realms of the otherwise habituated or possible or areas of more morphic fields
or rooms.
Different spheres of human experience. There's the alcohol sphere, there's the LSD sphere, there's the heroin sphere. Incidentally, the heroin's legal too, if you think about it. It's legal for people who are dying. In our society, it's the officially recognized drug of death, and it's admissible to use it in hospices, heroin and morphine, to dying patients to ease them through the pains of death. So it is legal in our society, but it's the death drug.
Yes, you have to retain a certain, not only age, but a state.
Yes.
Of death, near death.
So it's interesting, it's another example of a legal drug that's legal under certain conditions, but not others. It occurred to me that, heroin and opium, easing the pains of death aspect of those drugs, has a kind of traditional lineage of, opium is a kind of painkiller, that's long been known. And as a visionary substance, it's a long...
A dream drug.
A long lineage, it's a dream drug, dream and death drug. Whereas cocaine, because in its original form taken by Indians when climbing hills and so on, was a work drug. And indeed, that's what it still is for the yuppie cocaine takers that we read about in magazines.
That's right.
So they have qualities, drugs have qualities, and they open up different realms of experience. And so there'd be different drug days and different thresholds, initiations through life and that kind of thing. But still, we have to ask the question, how do these visions, which are the most intense that certainly I've experienced, how do these visions relate to the actual unconscious or consciousness of the natural world? Or how much are they mansions created by the human imagination? That the astral plane, as it were, has a cumulative memory of all previous journeys on it. And certain recurrent kinds of dream, fantasy, adventure, dream, archetypal progress are kind of morphic fields in that realm. So there's all these things that have ever happened in that realm, and including adventures, constructions, creations, experiences, surprises, interpretations that have occurred to previous psychedelic voyagers. So there's this cumulative geography.
A kind of Akashic record.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the unconsciousness contains all this, and different drugs give different accesses to different parts of it. And so the question is, how much of it would be a kind of cumulative record of this creative edge of the human imagination, or how much of it is a communication through that openness from the spirit of the plant, or of the earth, or
the spirit of a star.
Or the spirit of a star. Or whatever is invoked. You see, I suppose that given the laws of ceremonial magic, and indeed of prayer in all traditions, are that whatever power or presence or being you want to speak to, you first invoke. Our Father who art in heaven, Hail Mary, full of grace, Om Shivaya. You start by invoking the being or entity to whom you're addressing yourself by name. And so what would happen if, for example, one took a powerful psychoactive that opened one to the astral realm in the starry sense, and then invoked a particular star by name, and tried to journey or connect with or become open to influences from that star? This would be one way of doing it. I'd be rather frightened to try it myself.
Well, these are the questions only the future will answer, that kind of thing. Because
you mean this kind of research project?
Yes, this kind of research has to lie in the future.
Well, I think we should maybe come back to your starting point about this bifurcation theory. You started with a bifurcation theory model of consciousness and the unconscious. And I think this bifurcation is happening the entire time. It's the habituation process, which is the kind of opposite of bifurcation. What you have in habituation is like we have an awareness of that machine. If it were going on all day, we wouldn't notice it. So there's a kind of movement from an awareness of duality, a separation of oneself from what's heard, a kind of consciousness of subject and object that reverse bifurcates unifies into an unawareness of the difference between subject and object, which is the habituated state. So it may be that consciousness, by its very nature, involves a kind of selective awareness.
That we've missed my initial idea without replacing it, because I agree that the history of consciousness, I just sort of adopted for the sake of discussion this idea of the consciousness of the planet and so on. I agree that the history of consciousness is more properly called the history of unconsciousness, and it's the nature of the mind to be unconscious most of the time, because consciousness is a crowded little window. However, this other idea of experience being denied on basis of authority and dogma and ritual and so on, that which should be ours, our heritage of perception and experience, vanished from us by denial. The idea that chaos is bad, for example, that this is another kind of unconsciousness. This is the unavailable part of the unconscious, over which is illegal, difficult, and perhaps even impossible to fly your plane and look out the window of consciousness and observe it. It becomes unavailable. This is the dark part of unconsciousness, and this kind of unconsciousness, I think, is created at a certain time in history, and there is a bifurcation for it. And previously, certainly in microbial life, we do not have an idea of prohibited experience, of a denial of valid experience and so on. All it can be smelled, eaten, excluded, and so on. Exhaled. All of this is okay. Denial, I think, is a recent phenomenon, and here there's serious danger for our evolution, because once the experience is denied, then evolution is shunted off its track.
What point in time do you think it was when this happened?
Well, this patriarchal business, I don't know if the whole complex has a particular element which is the dominant, leading, or causative one. But there's the patriarchy, the patrilineal, the nuclear family, the identification of order with good and disorder with bad, the idea that order is only homeostasis or periodic phenomenon, that which has been associated with by Hamlet's mill, with the precession of the equinox, that the order of the heaven was broken by the equinoctial sunrise moving from one constellation to another, destroying all possibility, apparently, of understanding the heavens. Something around there, that is 6,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, that there was a special new mode of thought, prohibition of valid experience, was begun. And I think that's a real fall from grace. And on the basis of that, we have real evil now, which is the problem of life. There is this growing evil. There is the destruction of integrity. There is the death of nature, and so on. These are real problems, and I think that they're new problems, and that they have a history, and it has to do with denial. It's not only the Christianity that made certain experiences illegal. The spiritual, for example, deciding that the spirit is illegal in 879 in a synodic council, and a political meeting of bishops. This kind of thing, where the prohibitions of Islam, of Christianity, of Judaism, and so on, of political gatherings, and the repression of psychedelic drugs, of religious the destruction of the goddess, replacement of the goddess by gods, the destruction, the end of the magical invocation of the plentiful produce in the garden. And I mean, there's so many things that became illegal. There's a dogmatic rejection of actual experience, and then it creates a situation where we cannot fly our plane over this part of unconscious. We cannot reclaim a view of it. It's not legal to have a spiritual experience, to have men in this culture can't have an emotional experience. So finally, our consciousness is limited in a way which can't be restored simply by a willingness to devote one day to attention, variation, observation of the difference, or amplification of. It just becomes unavailable, and I think that we have touched on some means that can be used to restore, when it became legal, to try to heal ourselves from the effect of this denial. Then the means are there, and we've discussed them, but there's a political step which is necessary that we haven't touched upon, which would legislate into existence these henges and so on, which would make it legal to henge, would make it okay to henge. We don't know how to produce the station to regain what is lost. After something has become not okay, it's very hard to reclaim it. And the fact that chaos is considered so bad, it's very hard to undo this damage.
Except through observing chaos's day, which is like the Saturnalias, where they had the reversal of the social order and so on. Yeah. Holi is like that in India. Mm-hmm. All these Saturnalias, like May Day and May Eve in Europe.
The true goddess festivals.
Yes.
With serpents alive and well, dragons on the run, at play in the fields of the Lord. But these days still exist?
Well, they do, yes. I mean, Halloween is one example.
Morris dancing.
Halloween's one example.
Yes, Halloween is on the comeback.
And Halloween is in England, the All Hallows, the effect of All Hallows Eve, the reversal of the social order, is celebrated, and sometimes in many places, the night before Guy Fawkes, November the 4th, called Mischief Night, which is when people can carry out mischief that normally otherwise would be extremely prohibited. In Cambridge, when I was an undergraduate, there were regular fights every November the 4th on Mischief Night between undergraduates and town boys. gather in the market square, and there would be pitched battles, which culminated in my second year in the burning down of the police shed in the centre of the marketplace, and in something that went too far and involved large-scale police intervention, and the proctors of the university had to act to restore order. And from the following years, all undergraduates were prohibited to leave their colleges on mischief night, or at least had to return by 9 p.m, and had to be wearing at all times their academic dress and gowns so that they could be identified, which of course fanned up town attacks because undergraduates
were easy marks.
Anyway, this was all a relic of a kind of one of these reverses. So one is the Halloween or November the 4th, mischief night one. The other is the Mardi Gras Carnival, Shrove Tuesday, beginning of Lent festival. That's the other big one. These exist in places like Brazil. They exist as highly effective dissolvers of the social order into this kind of primal chaos, the carnival.
I'd like to see a resurrection of magic as well, and that magic should become white magic. There'd be some modern analog of voodoo in which one would seek to do well to a person. But I think it's possible to raise the frequency, to lighten the dark and so on of many places that had fallen into disuse, and that the garden maintenance had not been done, is overrun with weeds and so on, as it were, on the magical level, that these places could be sweetened with banishment ceremonies and so on. That we need to learn a technology that would sort of connect the star magic of the Kenjas and so on with the progress of daily life and the political events. Because we may have great powers that aren't being used since we don't believe in them. That this kind of reclaiming the denied, the illegal, the rejected, the dogmatically destroyed, the unavailable unconscious, which contains enormous powers for doing good, as it were, which have been somehow, they've been denied by the forces of evil acting through governments, churches, and so on, through councils of bishops, ecumenical councils, putting evil thoughts in the mind of somebody at a certain moment that they begin to lobby for a vote to deny, to reject, make illegal something which is actually an enormous power for good. I think that England is the place where these reversals seem to be going on at the maximum possible rate, involving a lot of people, supported by Kenjas still exist everywhere. And
I'm surprised you should think this. This is based on your recent visit to Glastonbury.
Yes.
And what happened?
Well, there's a lot of traffic going up and down Glastonbury Tor. There are people all over Glastonbury Abbey looking at it, loving it, studying the pictures of it restored, getting the feeling of the thing, understanding what it would be like to live in a society that had fantastic spiritual integrity. And particularly the studies of the ley lines and the St. Michael and St. Mary's lines that go up and down in the country there, where places like Avebury and Glastonbury belong to this line. And so many people are now marching this line. They're flying over it. They're photographing it from airplanes. They're walking along it. They're dousing it. They're having the personal experience of the pagan legacy, and they're re-evoking these things through discussions and publication of books and reading books and having meetings about and actually going to the sites. It's thousands of people. It's a holiday destination resort. Glastonbury Abbey, Dorchester Abbey, Dartmoor. It's incredible.
Yes, it's true. And there are a lot of earth mystery circles, and I mean, the lay hunters. I mean, these are mostly quite small societies, but they do exist. But I'd always assumed there must be something comparable here in the recovery of Native American traditions and sacred places.
No, not yet. There are teachers, and there are centers like Ojai and so on, where they have these people who seem still to be in quite good command of the old traditions. And they have workshops and people do come and so on, but it's just nothing like the scale of individual popular archaeology going on in England. It's decades away from that.
Really? Well, maybe there's some hope then. I didn't see England as being particularly a centre for this kind of thing. Although I think the corn circle mystery it's perhaps no coincidence that it's happened principally in England, because it's a perfect country to intrigue people. I think that whether the corn circles are the world soul, or the Gaian soul rather, working through in training vortices of wind, or working by direct kind of psychic kinesis, or however they're created, they're obviously a kind of message, because they've started quite recently. People would have noticed them before if they'd been going on for years. That in itself is intriguing, that they should start, and they happen near places like Silbury Hill and these ancient mostly in the west of England, where most of these power spots are. And everybody in Britain, in every pub up and down the country, television program, and from the Queen downwards, there was a report in the papers that she'd taken 2 books on corn circles with her for Christmas reading last year, because she was so intrigued by the phenomenon and often discussed it at the palace. From the Queen downwards, everybody's intrigued by them, and there's no clear hypothesis at all. It's kind of a koan that's being posed for the collective consciousness.
Well, there's a Journal of Seriology. I'm a subscriber. John Michel is the editor. The interesting thing is that all of this stuff has been connected up, and the whole Earth Mysteries movement, their motto is a kind of a general systems approach to all these different things. Try to synthesize the learnings about the ley lines, the henges, the corn circles into super understanding of the Gaian physiology and the relationship with our evolution and the history of consciousness. So it's the only place I know. Maybe in Brittany there's a French equivalent that we don't know much about because not knowing French well enough. But that's possible. I think the ley line idea actually occurred first in Brittany.
It seems to me that we've obviously been talking about the unconscious in a much wider sense. We've been talking about the Gaian unconscious, or the natural unconscious, in a much wider sense than Jung's still humanistic idea of the collective unconscious, which, although being unconscious, it's hard to assign it boundaries, is generally assumed by Jung and his followers to be confined to humanity.
Yes, a very limiting hypothesis, a dangerous hypothesis. The first one that we want to transcend is the separation of the human unconscious from the other unconscious. So
that's a curtain. That's one of the curtains you're talking about consciousness, because as soon as you say that the human unconscious is separate, or the human consciousness was the first thing Descartes said, separate from the entire realm of matter, then you get the idea of the unconscious, an extension of mind, and that separate from the unconsciousness of the rest of nature. You've cut off human consciousness into a human sphere or balloon with no windows, no true windows or openings to the world of nature.
I think one of the important correlates that I'm always hesitate to mention, or mention last, is eating meat, domesticated animals and eating them. I mean, they're like the Maasai, for example. You have dairy, and then you have eating the older animals when they die. That's one thing. But then, like, breeding them and killing them only to eat them is another. And I think it's impossible to do that at the same time that you imagine a continuity between your own spirit and the spirit of the animal. So associated with this animal domestication and eating habit, addiction, is the denial of consciousness in the animals, which is one of those veils, which then excludes microbes, plants, and the whole of Gaia. It's a human-centered veil-generating device is eating these things, or drinking the blood instead of the milk.
Yes, that seems quite... it is associated with the dominator mode, presumably. This idea, since the dominators came out of herders and hunters, rather than the agricultural people. By conquering the fixed agricultural set, the dominators were agricultural pastoralists, and presumably the model there is that just as you break horses and you dominate flocks of sheep and cows by riding around on horseback, or by whatever means you use to dominate or frighten, you get the sheep into sheepfolds, and shepherds control the flocks and so on. Then it's a short step from doing that to people, where people become the herds. And
human sacrifices were common in the rituals, and probably the sacrifice meat was eaten. They used to have a meat shop outside the temple, because after the sacrifice, of course, they'd sell the meat. And that was considered bad for the temple to raise money by selling the meat of the sacrificed animal. So in the case of the human sacrifices, with the Mayans, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if eating the victim was part of the practice. Mm. And this certainly must involve a lot of denial. And these denials are kind of one-way transactions. It's very hard to recover. I suppose it takes generations of being vegetarian before you could relate to a food animal like a cow. I had a friend, Danielle. He'd see a cow, and then the cow would say to Danielle, moo, and Danielle would say, hamburger. I think we should quit here.
Well, I guess if you weren't already a vegetarian, that you're either going to give it serious thought right now, or or you're going to put Ralph's comments about eating a conscious animal right out of your own consciousness. It's an interesting choice, don't you think? As I was listening to this conversation with you just now, it struck me how well the subscribers to this podcast would fit into the ebb and flow of the discussion. You know, some of the emails I've received lately lead me to believe that you guys could hold your own with these trialoguers. Which brings me to a suggestion that Tom made recently about trying to put together a Skype cast with multiple participants. He began by saying, I continue to enjoy the trialogues, but I must confess I am almost at a complete intellectual saturation with the ideas being presented. And then he went on to propose the Skype cast, where we could hear others' takes on the information being presented. Well, Tom, I do like that idea, and in fact, I've already been corresponding with some of the people over at the Cannabis Podcast Network about doing something like that. But I do like your suggestion of expanding the idea to focus on a particular trialogue or something like that. I can't say how soon any of this will be worked out, but even though the tech is basically here, it's a matter of finding the time to fit something new like that into our schedules. But eventually, I'm sure we're going to be doing some things like that, and in the meantime, I'm about to release the upgrade to the Notes from the Psychedelic Salon blog, where I'll be posting the program notes to these podcasts in the near future. And that way you can all interact, at least within the comment section for each podcast. I originally set that up as a wiki, but not many people participated in it, and when I upgraded the wiki software a couple weeks ago, it put some kind of a bug in there that has the entire wiki locked up right now. And I haven't taken the time to fix it because I think the blog and comment format will be easier for everybody to use. I also got a nice email from Lauren, who asked if I was torrent savvy. Well, Lauren, I wish I could say I was, but that wouldn't be very accurate. I am aware of how BitTorrent works in general, but I still haven't had the time to get into the full technical details of what needs to be done to make these podcasts more torrent-friendly. But thanks to John M., I've begun to look into it, and once the new blog is finished, you hopefully will find several options for listening to these podcasts, and torrent will be one of them. I also want to mention an artist who was brought to my attention by Sharon, who wrote about Dennis Numkina, whose paintings have been speaking to the subject of the Hopi migration from this, the fourth world, into the fifth, final and most peaceful world throughout his career. And she went on to say that several of his paintings are, and I quote, on display at the University of Richmond, but are due to be moved, new placement yet to be determined. They are each 7 foot by 7 foot and full of mythology, symbolism, and juicy color. If you want to know more, you can visit the website at www.numkena.com. Well, thanks for sending that information, Sharon, and if you find out where the new placement for these paintings will be, please let us know. Now that I've seen some copies of Dennis's work, boy, it's really breathtaking in its scope and beauty. I can just hardly imagine what it would be like to experience this art in person, so I'd love to find out where it's going from here. Also, I got a nice email from Jeffrey, who has been a fan of Terence McKenna's since first meeting him back in 1991. Well, you were really lucky, Jeffrey. I only met him for the first time in 1998, and so I didn't have all that many opportunities to hear him in person before he died. But But I do have a lot of his old tapes because, fortunately, my wife first heard him speak at a conference in the early 1980s. And then she managed to hear him several times a year after that. So I've got a lot of Terrence around here. And Jeffrey, by the way, I really also appreciate you mentioning the fact that you used the program notes for one of the trialogues to find a quote that you remembered from the program. Well, for what it's worth, that is the very first mention I've received about the program notes that I've started doing for these podcasts. They still aren't up to the level of the notes that you'll find on the Sea Realm or over at the Cannabis Podcast Network, but now that I know that they're being used, I'm all charged up about making them better as time goes on. So, thanks for mentioning that, Jeffrey, and also thank you for contacting the Institute of Noetic Sciences about these trialogues. Here's what Jeffrey had to say about ions. Quote, I've been so captivated by the trialogues that I emailed Ralph and asked him if he would consider granting ions access to his collection of tapes as well. He replied in assent. End of quote. And so, now it looks like these trialogues may continue to increase their distribution on the Internet. By the way, if you don't already know about ions, you'll probably really find it worth your time to see what they have to offer. You can find them online at www.ions.org. And I highly recommend their magazine for those of you who are into offline reading as well. Finally, I want to comment on a wonderful email I received from Cooper, who describes himself as a high school student living under the oppressive educational system. And he went on to say, quote, I'm sure you may already have some picture of this, but I really just wanted to bring your attention to the fact that your audience is not just comprised of the established core following and the regular burners, but your podcast has succeeded in reaching out to new people, such as myself, who have no prior affiliation with the larger community. Well, it's really good of you to point that out, Cooper, because your generation is exactly who I'm really hoping to reach with these podcasts. You know, ever since that twisted little mind of Nancy Reagan came up with her Just Say No campaign, the schools in the states have been brainwashing the most important members of our society into equating the use of entheogens with the use of things like methamphetamines, crack cocaine, and other non-psychedelic substances. I think it's critically important that your generation reformulate Mrs. Reagan's nonsensical saying by spelling no, K-N-O-W. And the best place I know of to begin to K-N-O-W more about these important plants, chemicals, and states of mind is at erowid.org. That's EROWID.org. You know, if people don't get anything else out of these podcasts, I hope that they learn that there's a significant amount of good information available about this important subject. Another example of good information out there is the Entheogen Review. This is a little periodical that comes out about 4 times a year and bills itself as the Journal of Unauthorized Research on Visionary Plants and Drugs. And in the latest edition, you can find articles like one by Dr. Rick Strassman, who did the Breakthrough DMT research study, and in that he talks about becoming a psychedelic researcher. Also, John Hanna has a must-read essay titled Security Issues in the Underground. And for you kitchen chemists out there, you might be interested in the article titled DMT for the Masses. And there's also a fascinating article about entheogens in video games, in addition to a whole bunch of other information that you might find interesting. And you can find more about the ER at www.entheogenreview.org. ENTHEOGENREVIEW, all one word, .org. At least if that kind of information interests you, that's a really good periodical, I think. I guess that was just a long-winded way of saying that I really appreciate all of you out there with us here in the Psychedelic Salon, no matter what your age or experience level with these sacred medicines. Because, you know, after all, our focus here in the salon is primarily on the state and evolution of human consciousness and on our own individual consciousnesses. So, thanks to all of you for spending a little of your time with us here in the salon each week. It's nice to know you're here. And before I go, I guess I should mention that this and all of the podcasts from the Psychedelic Salon are protected under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 2.5 license. And if you have any questions on that, you can click on the link at the bottom of the Psychedelic Salon webpage, which may be found at matrixmasters.com/podcasts. And if you still have questions, you can send them an email to lorenzo@matrixmasters.com. And thank you to Chateau Hayuk for letting me use your music here in the Psychedelic Salon. And for now, this is Lorenzo, signing off from Cyberdelic Space. Be well, my friends.